Chapter 29. You're absolutely certain? Josie shifted to watch Thomas's reaction to her father's question. They were once again seated at the kitchen table, but this time she hadn't hidden Thomas's presence. Earlier, he'd gone home to shower and change clothes and pray for wisdom, while she'd done the same. It was just after 7 o'clock in the morning. She felt like she'd lived an entire day in 2 hours. I refuse to be the reason you vote yes on this bill, sir, Thomas said. If you decide to do that for Josie's sake, I'll understand. But don't do it for mine. Dad stared at the screen for a long time before he spoke again. You're willing to give up your political aspirations for this? I don't have aspirations. Our current mayor's corrupt, and I wanted to stop him from doing any more damage to my town. But if he gets elected, I have to leave that in God's hands. And what about Josie? Dad asked. What are your intentions toward my daughter? Thomas glanced her way, one side of his mouth tipping up. I intend to date her if she'll let me. I intend to get to know her better and take it from there. Are you the marrying type, Thomas? Heat rushed into Josie's cheeks. Dad had never shied away from difficult or awkward conversations. But really? Thomas didn't fidget or squirm. Instead, he spoke with confidence. My parents have been happily married for 45 years. I was fortunate to have an example of a solid, love-filled marriage. I've always wanted that. That's a good answer, son. Son? Seemed Dad's low opinion of Thomas was growing by the second. Dad shifted his attention to Josie. You're getting on a plane today, right? We need to come up with a plan for Thomas to deal with the fallout, should those pictures be released. I'm not going to abandon him here without a strategy. You can do that and be on a flight by the end of the day. She calculated the distance to the airport, the flight schedules she'd studied. Even if they spent all day strategizing, she should be able to make the latest one back to D.C. She'd rather be going to her childhood home, but both her parents were in Washington. I will. Thomas, you'll get her to the airport safely? I will. May I ask what your plan is at this point? They called the vote. I'll be there. You know Parker is going to ask, Josie said. What will you tell her? Lying to the majority leader is akin to political suicide. Dad blew out a long breath. But so is going against her on her pet projects. Either way, I have no future in the party. If they ask, I'll say, I don't see where I have any choice, or I'll do what I have to do, but I will not tell her my plans. That way, the bill will be defeated on the floor, which should kill it permanently. Do you think she knows what's going on? Thomas asked. Not the details, but I'm sure she's aware Mitchell's pressuring me. Thomas made a low noise in his throat, like a growl of disapproval. When you cast your no vote, is there any chance they'll accept defeat gracefully? None. Dad's single word hovered in the room like smoke in a house fire. Which is why we need to keep this circle very small. You two know how I'm voting, and Carlyle, of course. Nobody else. Keep it that way. We will, sir. Thomas slid his arm around Josie's waist and pulled her closer, kissing the top of her head, seemingly unconcerned about her father watching. Dad sighed. I'm sorry it's come to this, darlin'. I never wanted you to get hurt. I wish. His Adam's apple bobbed. I wish I could protect you. His voice cracked, and he swallowed again. Protect you from this. Were those tears misting his eyes? She'd never seen her father cry. The thought of it had her own eyes stinging. I know, Daddy. Her voice squeaked. The thought of anybody seeing that picture. It's okay. I'll be okay. Maybe they won't publish it. Hope infused Thomas's voice. Josie hated to pop that optimistic bubble of his, but Dad's enemies would not accept his defiance. The pictures would be published as retribution. Josie would be embarrassed. Thomas might lose the election, but the bill wouldn't pass. For that, this would all be worth it. We need to go, Dad. We need to figure out how to handle this. After Josie ended the call, she faced Thomas. I'm so sorry. He leaned forward and touched his forehead to hers. You don't have to apologize to me, but I do want you to promise me 2 things. First, that you'll leave today, no matter what happens. I want you to be safe until the backlash of your dad's decision blows over. She'd already been downstairs to talk to Kinsley and Marcel, and they were prepared to run the shop until she returned. She'd given Marcel the go-ahead to hire someone else to pick up the slack. I'll leave today, I promise. Second, he took a strand of her hair in his hand and slid his fingers down it, sending chills into her scalp that somehow reached her toes. Promise me you'll return. How had she come to depend so much on this man? He'd been her friend and confidant and champion. In the space of a month, he'd become one of the dearest people in her life. She slid her palm along his jaw, reveling in the smoothness of his freshly shaven face, and realizing that this man, this handsome, kind, self-sacrificing man, suddenly meant everything to her. Josie, I promise. They stared at each other a long moment. Her lips tingled, anticipating what was coming. A knock on the door shattered the sacred moment. The bodyguard, a stocky brunette with short-cropped hair, said, "Who is it?" "It's Shelley." Her shout came through the door. "You need to let me in." Thomas's lips spread into a slight smile. "To be continued." She liked the sound of that. Turning to the bodyguard, she said, "It's fine." The woman opened the door, and Shelley burst inside. "Oh my gosh, thank you!" She took in the sight of the stranger and said, "Who are you?" "Greta Wagner, security." "Oh." Shelley approached Josie at the table. "I just got off the phone with Carlisle. He told me what's going on. This is unbelievable. Somebody actually took photos." Tears filled her eyes and dripped down her cheeks. She fell to the floor in front of Josie and grabbed her hands. "You have to forgive me, Jo. I've screwed up the only friendship that means anything to me. I'm so, so sorry. Will you please forgive me?" Josie glanced at Thomas, who said nothing. Josie had already promised she would. God expected her to forgive as he did. She hadn't completely managed it yet, but he'd help her with that in time. Meanwhile, they had a situation to deal with. As much as she might have wanted to send Shelley away, she needed her expertise. "Of course I'll forgive you." Eventually. Shelley couldn't read her thoughts and took the words as Josie had known she would, as complete and immediate absolution. She threw her arms around Josie and hugged her tight. Josie couldn't help but smile at her old friend's exuberance. Then Shelley sat beside her. "I've got a guy analyzing the photo. If it's fake, he'll know." "It's fake." Thomas's serious tone didn't faze Shelley. "And in the end, maybe they won't release it." Shelley turned to Josie. "Your dad's voting yes?" Her smile spread across her whole face. "I knew it. I knew he wouldn't put you in this position. That's great news." Josie wasn't sure what to say to that. She didn't want to lie to her friend, but Dad had just told her not to tell anybody his plan. How could they strategize if Shelley thought the photo wouldn't be released? Before she could come up with a plan, Thomas jumped in. "The thing is," he said, "the photo is out there now." He told her about the call he'd received from the reporter the day before. "I have a bad feeling she has it, and if she does, the paper will publish it, not to use against Senator Harrington, but to use against me." Shelley nodded, studying him through squinted eyes. "I see what you're saying. It makes sense to get ahead of it." "What are you thinking?" Josie asked. "You two should release the photo, along with my expert's report. That way, you get to control the news cycle. I mean, you're the strategist here, Jo, but isn't that what you'd recommend? If it weren't Josie herself in the photo, maybe. Probably. If you release it," Shelley said, "you can blur anything you don't want the world to see. If somebody else releases the original or other pictures, well, that's what was already going to happen. Right? At least you'd have a modicum of control." "That's a good idea," Thomas said. No need to sound so surprised. With a hand on her chest, Shelley feigned offense. "I've been known to have my share." Thomas smiled at her, but the expression faded when he faced Josie. "What do you think?" Releasing the most revealing photo ever taken of herself to the public wasn't exactly high on her bucket list. But if she grayed out her body, if she released it with an explanation? "How would you go about it?" Shelley asked. "Would you just send an email or—" "No." Josie took herself and her embarrassment out of it. If this were a stranger, what would she do? A press conference. You can take questions, Thomas. It signals that you have nothing to hide. You too, Shelley said. If you're at his side, then you both show you have nothing to be ashamed of. Thomas studied Josie a long moment. You really want to do that? I want your campaign to not fall apart. Me too, but this feels drastic and humiliating. Shelley popped to her feet. Sometimes drastic is the answer, and because it's humiliating, more people will tune in and believe you. This is the perfect solution. Easy for Shelley to say. It wasn't her unclothed body in those photographs. But, though this would certainly embarrass Josie and expose her to the whole town as the daughter of a senator, it was the only idea that made sense if they were going to salvage Thomas's campaign and reputation. Because when Dad voted no, that photo and possibly others were going to be released. Mitchell and his people weren't exactly paragons of mercy. And if what Bentley said was true, Mitchell was dying to get his revenge. It was one thing for that revenge to cost Josie. For what she'd done, she deserved whatever came. But Thomas had done nothing wrong. Josie would do anything in her power to shield him from her moral failures. Josie followed Greta into the police station through the back entrance, Thomas at her side, and Donley bringing up the rear. It was just after 1 o'clock. The press conference was scheduled for 1:30 and would be held right next door. It had been no easy feat to schedule it, even harder to get the mayor to agree to have it on the steps of the town office building. According to Shelley, who'd made the request, Farley had flat out denied them. But Shelley was proving more adept than Josie had ever given her credit for. She'd argued that the town offices actually belonged to the town, not the mayor, and if Farley refused to let them have the press conference there, she'd make sure everybody knew the man was scared of his political opponent. She'd also explained that if Thomas messed it up, implying it was highly likely he would, him being a political novice and all would work out well. After all, she'd told Farley over the phone, why not give him a very tall platform from which to tumble? In the end, the mayor had agreed, though probably, at least in part, because Thomas had called on a few of the members of the town council to help persuade him. Josie's estimation of Shelley had jumped a few notches. The report had come back from Shelley's friend, showing that the photograph had indeed been altered. They had a link to his report that would be made public for the reporters to peruse after the press conference. While Donley and Greta waited in a conference room, Josie and Thomas met with the chief of police, an older, heavy-set balding man named Coate, who brought them up to speed on what they'd uncovered about the intruder and everybody they'd questioned so far. He explained that Shelley had made a few calls the night of the incident to her boyfriend, whom they'd spoken to. Shelley was not on the suspect list. The police were looking into the deposits made into Lake's account. She's still a suspect, Coate said, though her phone registered no unusual calls or texts. We aren't sure how she was communicating with anybody outside. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe they'd set it all up from the beginning. Maybe nobody was communicating with anybody, Josie said. Maybe the intruder just got lucky. Thomas said, Donley seems to think somebody well-trained could have learned Josie was in the room alone. He explained Donley's theories on that subject. Maybe, the chief said, or maybe the guy just doesn't want to believe his partner was taking bribes. That seemed equally likely. The chief continued, Bentley Kent's story checks out. His aunt's attorney forwarded her will. He inherited a sizable amount of money, enough for the new car and the down payment on the house in Fairfax. Bentley wasn't working against her. That didn't change the fact that he'd had an affair with her best friend, but at least she didn't have to suspect him of being complicit in all the horrible things that had happened to her. Thomas had told her that morning that Bentley'd called the night before and updated him on what he was up to. Though Thomas obviously wasn't impressed, weeks before, Josie had given Bentley the go-ahead to dig into Mitchell's life to try to find something to use against him. Tactics she'd sworn she'd never sink to again. She was thankful Bentley's efforts would be for naught. This drama was going to be over today, as soon as Dad cast his vote, which should happen at right about the same time as the press conference. Tomorrow, they'd deal with the fallout. Dad would either have to switch parties or resign from the Senate altogether. His party would never get past what they would see as betrayal. As hard as it would be for him, he'd served a lot of years. It might be good for him to go home and turn his attention to other endeavors. He'd always dreamed of being a college professor. Now would be a great time for him to start a second career. Whatever happened, Dad would be all right. Hopefully, after today's press conference, Thomas's campaign would be back on track. And then after she assured her parents she was healthy and happy, after this story was replaced by the latest juicy news, Josie would return to her coffee shop and the life she'd built in Coventry. The life she loved. Everybody would know she was the daughter of a senator, but she didn't think the townspeople would treat her much differently. Maybe, when she came home, life would be better than before. She'd be able to build friendships without worrying about revealing who she really was. And she'd have Thomas. When the chief was finished bringing them up to speed, they moved as a group, the chief, officers Tyler and Fontier, Donley, Greta, Thomas, and Josie, through the police station and into the attached town offices, where they met Shelley, who practically squealed with delight. "You wouldn't believe the crowd out there!" Josie and Thomas, flanked by Donley and Greta, waited just inside the wide double doors of the old building while reporters listened to Chief Coate and Officer Fontier explain Josie's drugging Sunday night and the intruder who broke into her house. It made sense to have them speak first, to give the background of the case before she and Thomas told everybody about the blackmail photograph. Officer Tyler stood on the far side of the room wearing his ever-present scowl. The chief had asked him to answer questions from reporters, but he'd flat out refused. The man was decidedly unimpressed by the whole thing. Josie and Shelley had sent the press release to all the major media outlets between Coventry and Boston. On his own, Thomas wouldn't have gotten nearly as good a response, but Josie had crafted the message to hint at a political conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Reporters had come in droves. Any minute now, she would tell the world her real name and who her father was. Meanwhile, Dad would cast his no vote. She kept glancing at her screen. The vote should happen soon. Carlyle would text her when it was done. Beside her, Thomas swallowed hard, staring out the window. He wore a dark blue suit with a white shirt and a blue tie, and looked handsome and trustworthy. His strong jaw was tight with worry, his brown eyes intent as he stared outside. He wore spicy, scented aftershave that had her wanting to lean closer. He glanced her way, worry clear in his dark eyes. "You've got this." "I don't know. It's not like Sunday's speech. I had days to prepare for that." He flipped through the index cards in his hand. "I could royally screw this up." She faced him, adjusting his arrow-shaped tie clip, which had tilted ever so slightly. Maybe. Or maybe she was making up excuses to touch him. What's with the arrow? "Gift from my dad, a reminder to keep walking the path, even when life is hard." "I like it." She smoothed his shirt. "You aren't going to screw it up. If I feel like you're floundering, I'll jump in. But I doubt you'll need me." He kissed her forehead. "If I make a complete fool of myself, will you still stand by me?" "I will." "Promise?" "I promise." His smile, when it came, transformed his face. It softened his strong jaw, lit his dark eyes. "I'm willing to lose my reputation, my business, and my run for mayor, as long as I don't lose you." A blush warmed her cheeks. "I'm honored." "You're worth it." It was as if the solid ground beneath her crumbled and she fell. It wasn't scary, though. No, it was the most surprising, joyful feeling in the world. Not a fall to an unknown and dangerous landing, but a fall into the arms, into the heart, of this good man. Was it love? Maybe not yet, but it could be. Thomas was focused on her as if nothing else mattered, as if they were the only two people in the room, as if hordes of journalists didn't stand outside. In his eyes, Josie saw her future. A squeal had her backing up, remembering where she was. Shelley had been looking out the window on the other side of the double doors. Now she hurried their way, beaming. "My gosh, can you see that? I just saw another van pull up. It's crazy. There are like hundreds of people out there. They're gathering all along the street and on the other side. I think the whole town is here. Thomas groaned. You're not helping. Josie squeezed his hand. Shelley giggled. Sorry, you two ready? Thomas swallowed hard and then nodded. A moment later, the doors swung open. Josie wasn't accustomed to being in the public eye. That was Dad's sweet spot, and Carlisle's, and even Bentley's. Josie'd always been more comfortable behind the scenes, but she stood beside Thomas on the steps facing the street, the reporters, and the town she'd come to love. She listened as Thomas explained the photograph that had been sent to them that morning, how it had been doctored, and what the sender's goals were. Someone, we aren't certain who, is trying to manipulate Josie's father, Senator Davis Harrington, into voting a certain way on a certain bill. We aren't at liberty to discuss which bill or which way he was being asked to vote. That aspect of this is between the senator and his constituents, not to mention law enforcement. Thomas went on to explain the photoshopped picture, promising to make available the expert's report. When asked if he would release the original photograph, Thomas smiled. I will not. If somebody else releases it, there's nothing I can do about that. But I'm not about to expose my friend to such humiliation. He smiled at Josie, and she smiled back, which brought on a whole new barrage of questions about their relationship, which had been the plan, and which they answered honestly. Thomas, for all the nerves prior to stepping out there, managed it perfectly. He was honest and humble. He was funny and charming. He even had the hardened reporters smiling as they took their notes and snapped their pictures. By the time they were finishing up, Josie was convinced they'd gotten ahead of what could have been a career-ending story for Thomas. The people of Coventry would stand by him after this. More of them could even swing to his side. He could win this race. All of this drama would be over, and they'd be able to go on with their lives. Assuming Dad had cast his vote.
Chapter 30. Thomas's heart was pounding as Shelley stepped to the microphone. That's all for now, she said. Thank you for coming. Thomas followed Josie back into the municipal building. The press conference had gone well, really well, at least from his perspective. He thought he'd handled himself skillfully. Josie had fielded the questions lobbed at her like the professional she was. But would it be enough? Once they were inside and the doors behind them closed, he glanced at her. Her smile carried unmistakable triumph. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. The sight of a very angry Mayor Farley on the edge of the old building's wide entrance sealed the deal. Thomas could barely contain his glee. Come on, come on! Donnelly's serious tone belied Thomas's mood as the bodyguard ushered them back through the door, connecting to the police station. They followed him, flanked by Zach on one side and Rich on the other. Greta was bringing up the rear. Shelley had driven her own car. She planned to hang around, try to overhear what the reporters had to say when it was all over. Thomas and the bodyguards would escort Josie to the airport, where she'd fly to D.C. and spend time with her parents. But she'd be back. She'd promised. The group walked in silence. Thomas couldn't stand it. Fireworks should be exploding. Bands should be playing. They defeated their enemies, protected their reputations, and stood up for their principles. This should be a moment of celebration, not fear. Right? He slid his arm around Josie. What did you? No time to chat, Greta said. Get to the car. Josie glanced his way, her smile still in place. She kept her voice low when she said, You nailed it. Donnelly had lectured them about getting out of there as fast as possible after the press conference. The man was paranoia on steroids today, but Thomas couldn't stop himself. They entered the hallway leading to the back door. It was dim and cramped, but he didn't care. He turned and swooped Josie off her feet, spinning her in a half circle. We did it! She giggled like a schoolgirl, and the sound did weird things to his brain. Put me down. But there was laughter in her voice, in her eyes. Holding her against his chest, Thomas planted a kiss on her beautiful, kissable mouth, and she welcomed it. She tasted of vanilla and victory. That's enough, Donnelly said. Fine, fine. Thomas put her down, smiling at her as he took her hand. When the back door opened, light spilled in. Donnelly's SUV was parked right by the exit, so they just had to cross a few feet and climb inside, and then Thomas would kiss Josie again. Maybe he'd kiss her all the way to the airport. He and Josie followed Donnelly into the light. A loud pop broke into his thoughts. Donnelly stumbled. Thomas reached out instinctively, but he missed the bodyguard, and the man fell. "Get down, get—" Zach's words were cut off, and he went down too. Before Thomas's brain caught up, his instincts sprang into action. He forced Josie down and covered her with his body. He needed to get her back inside. He looked up toward the door, expecting to see Rich or Greta there, beckoning him. The door was closed. Someone was down just outside it. Someone whose body would have to be moved in order to get it open. It was Rich. Rich was down. Shot? Was he dead? Another pop. Another. Something fell against him. A body. A body. Greta? Were they all down? All their protectors? This was a police station. Where was everybody? The pop, pop, pop of gunshots didn't let up, and then a strong hand gripped him and yanked him up. Before Thomas could react, a black hood was pulled over his head and cinched around his neck. The material was thin enough that light came through the weave. Something hard pressed into his back. A gun. "Move!" A hand on his arm propelled him forward. He was shoved into a vehicle, a van or something with a big cargo space. Doors slammed shut. The vehicle lurched forward. The sounds of gunshots faded into the background. Someone held Thomas down, reached in his pocket, took his phone. He didn't fight. He didn't care what happened to him, as long as Josie was safe. Please let her be safe. Please let her not be shot. Let her not be here. But someone struggled beside him. He tried to remove the sack over his head. A strong hand gripped his wrist. "Leave it, lover boy." It was a man's voice, a deep voice he didn't recognize. "Stop struggling, princess. I just want your phone." Thomas said, "Josie?" "Thomas." She said the word on a sob. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Silence." The man's voice echoed in the small space, and the vehicle careened around a corner, away from the police station, the bodyguards, and safety. They weren't allowed to talk. The vehicle had only driven for a couple of minutes, plenty of time for the man to handcuff Thomas's hands behind his back, and probably Josie's too, before it stopped. He heard a garage door closing. When the rumble silenced, the rear door of their vehicle opened. The same man who'd spoken before said, "Slide this way and stand." He did as he was told. With no way to see his surroundings, no hands to defend himself, he had little choice. He listened intently. Josie was behind him. Her breaths were shallow. She was sobbing softly. At least one other person was breathing, maybe the driver. Then a commotion. A door opening, feet scuffling, heavy breathing. 2 people at least had entered the garage. The man who'd spoken before said, "Were you followed?" Silence, but somebody was probably nodding or shaking a head. He hoped it was a nod, but then the man said, "Good." There were at least 4 people, maybe more. The man said, "Move, princess." Thomas heard her footsteps, felt when she stood near him. He leaned toward her, hoping to infuse her with courage he didn't feel. "It's going to be okay." "No talking." The fist came fast, a blow against the side of Thomas's skull that left him off balance, head throbbing. "Keep your mouth shut. Got it?" Thomas nodded. "Don't move." The man must have been speaking to Josie, because he gripped Thomas's upper arm and pulled him to the side. "Get in and be quiet." His head was shoved down and his face bumped into a cold metal surface. His legs were lifted behind him, and he was pushed inside the vehicle. "As far as you can go," the man said. Thomas managed to sit up and scooted backward until he bumped something hard. He sat with his back to what he assumed was one of the seats. A moment later, Josie was herded toward him. She settled beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Neither of them spoke, but just having her beside him, warm and alive, alleviated a modicum of his terror. "Just get her out of this, Lord. Show me how I can protect her." Never in his life had he been so afraid. Never in his life had he felt so helpless. Doors closed all around. The garage door opened. The vehicle backed out, then lurched forward. It was so quiet. Were they alone? He wanted desperately to speak to her, but he held his tongue and bumped her shoulder. "You okay?" she asked. A hard blow landed on the side of Thomas's knee, and he sucked in a breath. Josie gasped. "Here's the deal," the man said. "You seem to have trouble taking direction. If you tick me off, princess, Your boyfriend gets hurt. If you give me trouble, lover boy, she gets the punishment. You fight me, the other one pays the price. There was shifting, and when the man spoke again, his voice was much closer. If you escape, princess, I'll put a bullet in his head. More shifting, and then, I don't want to hear either of your voices again, so nod if you understand. Thomas nodded. He assumed Josie did the same. Settle in. We've got a ride ahead of us. These people were smart. Too smart. They didn't have to worry about being spotted or caught since they'd changed vehicles. Nobody would be following them. Nobody would find them. Thomas thought maybe 30 minutes had passed. 30 minutes of winding roads that, thanks to the lack of seats and hands, had him struggling not to crash into the wall on one side or Josie on the other. Then the vehicle left the pavement and bounced along what felt like a dirt road, or maybe it wasn't a road at all. They traveled on that for a little while, but they couldn't have gone more than a mile or so when they jerked to a stop. Doors opened and slammed, and then the door that led to the cargo area opened. Through the black hood, Thomas saw daylight. He started to inch toward that light, but the man said, "Don't move." He stilled, and Josie nestled beside him. And then came the electronic sound every phone makes when a photograph is taken. "Okay," the man said, "come, come," like they were trained dogs. But Thomas wasn't about to protest and cause Josie pain. His head was throbbing, his knees smarting. The last thing he wanted was for Josie to pay for his defiance. He scooted forward, reached the edge of the vehicle, and hopped down, soft bracken beneath his feet. With a rough grip on his arm, he moved in the direction he was propelled. Up a few wooden steps and inside a room that smelled old and musty. He was guided across a wooden floor. A door creaked, and Thomas was pushed forward again. The world got darker on the other side of the hood. "Careful," the man said. Thomas tapped his foot forward and bumped into something. A step. It was a very narrow staircase, and steep. The man pressed a hand to Thomas's back as he went up slowly, feeling his way and counting. There were 12 steps. They entered a hot, stale space that stank of age and death. The floor was wooden and creaky. He was pushed across the room. "Turn around and sit." He did. "Lean forward." Again he did. The man reached behind him, pulled at the handcuffs around his wrists. Thomas felt something cold and hard. Metal. When the man backed up, Thomas realized his handcuffs had been attached to something else. Maybe other handcuffs, which were attached to a metal pipe. "Your girlfriend will be right up. If you two behave yourselves, you should be out of here by the end of the day." Thomas wasn't sure he believed that. On the other hand, he had no idea who these people were, or where they'd taken them, or even how many there were. There'd only been one voice. Theoretically, if Thomas and Josie were let go, they wouldn't be able to lead anybody back here or to identify their captors. But the police had ways. Maybe their captor had left a hair, a fingerprint somewhere. Maybe they could be found. And if this guy was caught, Thomas would remember his voice. He'd never forget the man's voice. A few minutes after he left, footsteps sounded again on the wooden staircase, and then Josie sat beside him, probably cuffed to the pipe, just like he was. More footsteps on the stairs, these getting quieter. A strange creaking noise was followed by a thump, and then silence. He strained to hear. Beside him, Josie cried softly. Her shoulders shook against his side. Was there anybody else there? He needed to know, but he wasn't about to risk her getting hurt. He nudged her shoulder. She nudged him back. But then nothing. He needed her to say something to see if they were alone. If not, then he'd be the one they hurt. He decided to try to force her to speak. He started coughing, hard, gasping as if he couldn't breathe. Finally, she said, "You need water?" He stilled, waiting for a blow, but nothing happened. "I think we're alone," he said. "You faked that? Did they hurt you?" "No, I'm okay." He heard tears in her voice. "I'm so scared." He was too, but saying so wouldn't help. It's a good sign they haven't let us see their faces. Maybe it means they're going to let us go when they're done. He hoped anyway. Not until they've forced Dad's vote. You heard the camera shutter, right? Shouldn't the vote have already happened? Right before you kissed me, I got a text from Carlisle. The vote was postponed for this afternoon. A curse word slipped out. Everything they'd done had been for nothing. And that kiss Had he made everything worse? If they'd left the building a few seconds earlier, would it have made a difference? Was this all his fault? Maybe. Maybe not. Whoever done this had been one step ahead of them all along. But something didn't sit right. Your father gave the majority leader Parker the impression he was going to vote in favor of the bill, right? Even if the press conference made them suspicious, how could they have set this all up in time? I mean, we were behind the microphones for what? 15, 20 minutes? There's no way this operation was set up that fast. Maybe they knew before then how Dad planned to vote, Josie said. How? Who else knew? You, me, your father. Do you think he told Bentley? Dad said just the four of us, remember? Him, you, me, Carlisle. The name fell between them. Carlisle? Josie sounded equally shocked and dismayed. Oh my gosh! He's my father's oldest friend. I can't believe he'd do this to Dad. To me. I've known the man since I was a child, as long as I can remember. Thomas didn't know what to say. I wish I could think of another possibility, but all indicators point to him. Why? Why would he do that? She sounded so defeated as she rested her head on Thomas's shoulder. Money? Power? Thomas guessed. No. He thought back to those terrifying seconds at the police station. Donley had been shot. Though he hadn't seen it happen, Greta must have been too, and Rich, whose body had blocked the door. If not for that, they might have been able to get back inside. What had happened to Zach? Had he been shot as well? Thomas prayed for the bodyguards and the officers, his friends. Even if Carlisle had figured out the senator was going to vote no, how would he have known Thomas and Josie's plan to leave after the press conference? Though the municipal office building and the police station shared a wall, there was a stockade fence separating their parking lots. Wouldn't the shooters have assumed they'd exit from the municipal building, not the police station? Had someone seen Donley's SUV? Except it wouldn't have been moved until the very last minute. Donley had given the keys to a uniformed police officer and told her to move it when the press conference ended. How many minutes had passed between that moment and when they'd stepped out the back door? 2, 3? More because of the kiss, but not that much more. Had Carlisle known the plan? About the press conference, of course, but about their escape route? Thomas had been with Josie all day, and he never remembered her going into that level of detail with her father. But somebody... Shelley? No. Donley hadn't told Thomas and Josie the plans until they'd been in the SUV. Shelley had driven separately. Donley and Greta. He couldn't imagine either of them turning against Josie, and both of them had been shot, right? Who else knew? Rich and Zach had helped Donley set it all up, but Thomas had known both of them most of his life. They were both married, both small-town cops. Surely they wouldn't have betrayed Thomas and Josie. Or maybe they had. Somebody had. Somebody Thomas trusted. I'm sorry I didn't protect you. That was all he'd wanted to do, protect her, and he'd failed, miserably. Lord, what do I do now? He'd taken it upon himself to protect the people he cared about a long time before, but now he couldn't do anything to save Josie. He couldn't even save himself. Help us, Father. Do what I can't do. Do what only you can do. This isn't your fault, Josie said. This is my fault. This is entirely my fault. He shifted toward her, wishing he could see her face. What are you talking about? She sighed. That secret you asked me to tell you last night. It's the reason Mitchell is willing to go to such lengths. It's the reason I deserve exactly what I'm getting. Thomas pressed his shoulder against hers again, wishing he could wrap her in his arms. He wanted desperately for her to tell him, but he wouldn't ask again. He pressed a kiss through the hood onto her head. Whatever happened, I'm sure it wasn't that bad. She sighed, the sound long and low, and his heart raced. What could be so terrible that it would justify this?
Chapter 31. When Josie had decided to tell Thomas the truth, she'd never imagined she'd do so from beneath a hood, her hands cuffed behind her back. She'd never imagined this scenario in a million years. Jesus, Jesus! She'd been sending up a steady stream of prayers, not that she deserved God's help. Deserved? Certainly not. but in God's economy, who deserved anything good? She might not deserve his help, but she'd shamelessly ask for it anyway. It wasn't about what she deserved, after all. God was all about grace. Jesus had been sent not to save the well, but to save the sick. Not to rescue the righteous, but to redeem the lost. She'd been lost, and God had pursued her and drawn her back to himself. He loved her enough to let his son die for her. That was a depth of love Josie didn't understand, and probably never would. So maybe God would rescue her and Thomas. But maybe he wouldn't. Maybe this would end with them walking hand in hand into eternity. Tears stung her eyes and dripped down her cheeks. She didn't want to die. That small, faithless part of her was afraid of it. But she knew that God had a place for her in heaven, and a place for Thomas. Her death might kill her father, but Mom's faith was strong, maybe strong enough for both of them. God could hold all of them in his capable hands. She was afraid, but she could face it. And she could face Thomas's rejection. He deserved to know what he'd stepped into. He deserved to be prepared for whatever would come. It was during Dad's last re-election campaign, she said. Our state's been moving steadily toward the other side for some time, so we already knew it was going to be a tough general election. This was back when our party had a true majority in the Senate, so his vote didn't matter as much, and he was able to vote his conscience, and his constituents' will, without so much pushback from the leaders. Now, of course, the Senate is evenly split, so Dad's vote is often critical. We have a functional majority because the vice president always votes. I know how our government works, Josie. Thomas's voice held a hint of amusement. You can skip the civics lessons. You'd be surprised how many don't understand this stuff. Anyway, Dad had voted against one too many bills Mitchell supported, and Mitchell was tired of it. From his perspective, whether Dad or the other party's candidate won the election, both would vote against the bills he supported. But if Mitchell got lucky and his candidate won, he'd gain a strong ally in the Senate. That makes sense, Thomas said. Dad had a strong pro-choice opponent, and Mitchell's organization started donating heavily to him. Dad is very popular in our state, and we thought he'd win the primary despite the opponent, but only after spending a lot of money and taking a lot of hits that would hurt him later. He'd be much weaker going into the general election. We tried to get the party to put pressure on Mitchell to stop donating to his opponent, but that didn't work. So we decided to find another way to get him to back off. This was where the story got bad. She was tempted to stop. Thomas's voice was gentle when he said, "What did you do?" He would despise her for this. We needed leverage, so we started digging into Mitchell, his company, and all his various entities, the nonprofit, the lobbyist, all of it. We started hearing rumors of an affair. Mitchell's rather notorious for always having a woman on the side. As far as anybody can tell, his wife never believed the rumors. So we set out to prove them. We got the woman's name, she was a 20-year-old intern, and we hired somebody to hack her social media accounts. In a private message, she posted, "SSB and me are going to Aruba." She gave the details, even where they were staying. What's an SSB? My guess is super secret boyfriend. Oh, Thomas didn't sound impressed. Wow. Remember, she was only 20, as in, a few months before, she'd been a teenager. How old is Mitchell? Late 50s. Gross. Yeah, she said. I know. So we hired an investigator who followed her to Aruba. The next day, Mitchell showed up. They had a private villa, a private beach, which they took full advantage of. Meaning, oh, wait. Yeah, our guy got lots of pictures, revealing pictures. We blew up the shots, had them FedExed to Mitchell's office the day of his return, and added his candidate's campaign photo with a note on the back that simply read, "Back off." I bet that was effective, Thomas said. It was, and they should have left it at that. Just to be safe, though. This was the part she didn't want to share. She barreled forward. We sent the same pictures to the girl with another note. Tell your SSB to back off or everybody will find out. Thomas said nothing. It was awful. She was a child. We should never have. We just got so caught up in winning that we forgot there was a person behind those glossy photos. A young woman with parents and siblings, with dreams and desires. We forgot. Thomas was quiet for a beat. When he spoke, his voice was still gentle. What happened? We can only speculate at this point. Maybe she was distraught and didn't know what to do next. Maybe she showed the note to Mitchell and they fought. If she showed it to him, then he would have asked about the SSB comment, right? He would have known she was the reason he'd been caught, so maybe they fought and he dumped her and broke her heart. Or maybe... She let her voice trail. She didn't want to think about the third option. A few days after we sent her the pictures, she swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills. The pitch of Josie's voice rose on the last words, squeaky and filled with emotion. She couldn't stop that emotion for all the money in the world. Her little brother found her the next morning. It was too late. Oh, Josie. Again, Thomas leaned in, pressing his shoulder against hers. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that happened. Don't be sorry for me. Be sorry for that little boy, for her parents and her other siblings. For her, a woman at the very beginning of her life who decided it wasn't worth living because of what I did. She waited for Thomas to tell her it wasn't her fault, but he was quiet for a long time. Because it was her fault. You started to say something, Thomas said finally, like you have another theory about what happened to her. There were things that didn't make sense. A few of the pills were in her throat, which could mean they'd been forced into her mouth, or it could mean she passed out before she swallowed them. There were marks on her bedroom window, like maybe somebody had broken in, but that was inconclusive. And she had bruising on her neck. Light bruising, though. The photographs weren't there. Of course, she might have hidden them or burned them. Anyway, despite the questions surrounding her death, the coroner ruled it a suicide. Bentley always thought. Josie had always secretly hoped Bentley's theory was true. It would let them off the hook for what they'd done. But what was happening now changed the game. If Bentley's theory was true. Thought what? Thomas asked. She talked too much, Josie said. She was the reason we found out about their affair. Through social media, she'd told most of her friends about her so-called SSB. If Mitchell hacked her accounts like we did, then he knew her lack of discretion had been his downfall. Bentley believed that Mitchell had her killed. Oh. There was a long silence, and then Thomas said, so maybe he's a killer. He's an abortionist. He's definitely a killer. It's not the same, though. Abortion providers don't believe they're committing murder. They find ways to justify it. But to murder someone you cared about, someone you knew. I assume you told the coroner and the police about the photos? She closed her eyes, not wanting to answer. But it was too late for that now. I wanted to, but Bentley said we shouldn't, that it would blow back on Dad. A woman was dead, Josie. I can't believe your father would condone. Dad didn't know about any of it. Huh. There was a long silence before he spoke again. Forget law enforcement. Maybe the guy killed somebody, but he gets away with it because that's how the game is played. She swallowed the knee-jerk defense that rose to her throat. He was right. Of course he was right. The game, Thomas said. Bentley told me that last night. I suggested we should try to prove Mitchell was behind all the things that happened to you. He seemed more interested in getting revenge than getting justice. I care about justice, Thomas, she said. I quit the game. That's why I'm not in politics anymore. That's why I live in Coventry, not D.C. When this is all over, if we make it out of here, I'll be seeking justice. For herself. Because Mitchell and his cronies had harmed her. But what about that young intern? Did Josie care about her? About her family? If she'd cared more about that woman and less about her own reputation, maybe none of this would be happening now. She'd gone along with Bentley and Carlisle, but she knew in her heart that, if her father had known what happened, he'd have urged her to tell the police everything. Dad wouldn't thank her for what she'd done. It was time to do the right thing. She pulled in a breath of faith, of courage. I'll go public with everything that happened back then. The story makes me look bad, but my public image is nothing compared to the grief that family has endured. They deserve to know the truth. I think... Thomas paused a long time before he spoke again. I think that's a good idea. I wish I didn't. The last thing I want is for you to be hurt. But as hard as telling the truth will be on you, I think it's your only path to freedom from what happened. Maybe it would destroy her reputation, but the people who loved her before, truly loved her, still would. Even if nobody else did, God's love would never change. She felt his pleasure even then. When we first started working together, Thomas said, you told me that I needed to beware of people doing underhanded things on my behalf. This was what you were thinking about. I'm always thinking about it. A moment of silence then. Carlyle knows what Mitchell has against you. I think so, maybe not all of it, but enough. And still, he helped set this up. Oh, Josie couldn't believe it was true, but nothing else made sense. Okay, Thomas said. Okay, that's a lot of information to take in. She expected him to distance himself from her, emotionally and physically. Instead, he nuzzled closer. She shut her eyes and breathed in his warmth, his presence, wishing she could see him, wishing she could make out his scent over that of the musty space and the scratchy fabric over her head. Hey, Josie? Yeah? You and Bentley never meant for that girl to get hurt. Emotion closed off her throat, preventing her from responding. You didn't want that to happen any more than I wanted Amber to get attacked, any more than you wanted to hurt Shelley when you moved away. We can't know all the consequences of our decisions. Maybe you and Bentley went too far. Maybe. That's between you and God, sweetheart. But you didn't put those pills in that girl's mouth. Maybe she killed herself. Maybe Mitchell killed her. Either way, it wasn't you. The emotion in her throat escaped on a sob. It had been 4 years, and she'd thought about that girl every single day. She'd thought about the girl's parents, her siblings, that poor little 8-year-old boy who'd never be the same after finding his sister's body. Every single day, she'd begged God to forgive her. Maybe it was time to accept that he already had. She wept against Thomas's shoulder, wept for that family, wept for the woman she used to be, so focused, so determined to win, that she hadn't cared who got hurt in the process. She wasn't that person anymore. She was forgiven. She was a new creation. That didn't mean she would escape the consequences of what she'd done. Not in this life, anyway. Josie had spilled more tears than she'd known she had, and then she'd spilled more. Now she felt spent, exhausted. But nothing had changed. They were still trapped, still blind with hoods over their heads. She wore a sleeveless dress, but the room was stifling. She hated to think how hot Thomas must be in his suit and tie. They were just waiting, waiting, waiting. Would this wait end with freedom or death? Come to think of it, either way, it would end with freedom. Thomas had been uttering a constant stream of prayers beside her, and even through her tears, she'd silently joined him. They needed help, and they needed it desperately. That strange creaking noise she'd heard before was followed by someone tromping up the steps. She braced herself as the man crossed toward them. A light hit her. It was blinding even through the hood. And then, suddenly, her hood was yanked off. She winced in the brightness. She could barely make out the image of a man behind the flashlight he shined in her face. In his other hand, he held a phone. Say cheese. The camera clicked a series of shots, rapid fire. When he was done, he tapped his screen, then reached the phone toward her. Say something. What do you want me to? Josie! It was her father. Are you? That's enough. The man yanked the phone back. She's alive for now. Do what you have to do, and she'll stay that way. He turned and climbed back down the stairs. A moment later, the creaking sounded, and then the loud thump, leaving her and Thomas in silence. That was it. Dad would vote for the bill, going against everything he believed and all the promises he'd made to the people who'd voted for him. Even if he survived politically, making that compromise would destroy him. Maybe Dad could go back and undo it. Maybe, if they got out of this mess, they could go public with what happened. Forget playing the game. They could just tell the truth, all the truth. Surely people would demand that the president not sign the bill, assuming he didn't sign it today. Either way, they could bring Mitchell down. If they survived. Beside her, Thomas asked, You okay? She turned to him, blinked as his form came into view, and realized what it meant. He didn't put my hood back on. Oh, good, good. Look around. What do you see? It was dark, very dark. They were in an attic, rafters angled overhead beneath a steeply pitched roof. A little bit of light came through where the roof joined the floor. The floor was plywood. On the far side of the room, she caught sight of a trunk and a few boxes. She explained all of that. I see nothing we could use, certainly nothing within reach. Maybe a stray nail or something? He said. I think if we could get something skinny and hard, we could maybe pick the locks on the handcuffs. She studied the floor all around them, but it was clear of debris. I don't see anything. She turned back to him, and something on his chest glinted in the dim light. Your tie clip! Yes! Can you reach it? There was only one way to get it. With her teeth. She bent toward him, but the clip was too far away. Sit up higher and angle toward me. He did, and she tried again. A little more toward me? He turned, grunting, straining against the handcuffs. She did the same, pressing her mouth against his chest. I have to admit, I've had a few, thoughts about you and me, and... He chuckled. This is definitely not what I pictured. She wasn't about to join him in that laugh, no matter the giggle that tickled the back of her throat as she found the clip with her lips. She clamped her teeth on it and pulled. She sat up and tried to say, Got it. But with the clip in her teeth, it came out, Goo! He angled away. Drop it between us as far back as you can. She did, and it fell to the plywood. Thomas shifted, lifted his rear end, and sat on the tie clip. He slid back toward his hands. He did it a couple of times. Grunting, he tilted up, pressed his hands down. Got it? Yes. Now just to figure out how... It took a long time, a long time. She waited silently, trying not to rush him, praying that he'd be able to pick the lock on his handcuffs. And then... Done. He slid away from the wall, hands still behind his back. He'd picked the cuff that held him to the pipe. He leaned her way. Can you get my hood with your teeth? She bit the thick canvas, and Thomas pulled back. It took some wrangling, but finally he freed his head. He looked around at their prison and then turned to her. You can drop it now. She opened her mouth, and the hood fell to her lap. It's good to see you. It's good to see. Move as far forward as you can. I'll get your hands free, and then you can pick mine. It was a torturous process, him trying to unlock her handcuffs with his hands bound behind his back. But he did it, and then she took the clip and got his open. Finally, they were unbound, but still trapped in the attic. She felt like they'd managed the first step of a very long journey. A lot stood between them and freedom, not the least of which were a couple of men with guns on the floor below.
Chapter 32. Thomas moved and the plywood creaked. Unless they were very, very careful, their every movement would register downstairs. There were no windows in the attic, so the only way out was through the house. But suddenly the creaking thump made sense. It was attic stairs, the kind that pulled down from the ceiling. Even if they could cross the attic without anybody hearing, there was no way they could lower those stairs without getting caught. Sweat dripped into his eyes, and he desperately wanted to remove his jacket and loosen his tie. But he couldn't. If their captor came back, they'd have to pretend nothing had changed. "What are you thinking?" Josie whispered. "The only way we can get out of here is by luring someone up and overcoming him." "Okay, but how?" "They must have heard me coughing before. Maybe I can cough again, and then you can yell and ask for water. You and I will pretend to still be handcuffed. You'll have your hood off. I'll have mine on. When the guy comes close, I'll attack. I'll have the element of surprise. But you'll have the hood on. He'll have to take it off me to give me the water." "Oh, right. What if he's carrying a gun?" "He thinks we're bound. Did he have a gun out last time?" "Not that I saw. If he does this time, you'll tell me." "How?" "Just say it, like, what's with the gun?" Though they kept their voices low, he spoke with a high pitch that almost made her smile. Or sound panicked, maybe. "Oh my gosh, are you going to shoot us?" "Whatever feels right." A short laugh, and she said, "Panicked feels right." Thomas took her hand. "We've got this. We can do this." "What happens then?" "Hopefully, I can take the guy down, find a gun in his pocket, and then it got murky. There'd be another thug downstairs, at least one. He'd just have to improvise. And then I'll get us out of here." "What if he's not armed?" Thomas didn't have an answer for that. "We'll figure it out, Josie." Her mouth closed tight. She nodded, but she looked far from convinced. "Our only other option is to wait here until the vote is over, at which point maybe they'll let us go. Or maybe they'll kill us." He didn't want to say that, but it seemed as likely. Thomas leaned close, rested his hand against her neck, his forehead against hers. "Here's the truth. Alone, there's no way we can get ourselves out of this. But we're not alone. We've got God, and He's with us. Do you believe that?" "I do." He kissed her lightly. "Let's pray, and then let's do this." 5 minutes later, back in the positions their captor would expect, Thomas started fake coughing again, silently cursing the stifling black canvas over his head. After a moment of that, Josie yelled, Hey, can we get some water up here?" Nothing happened. No response. No noise from downstairs. Thomas kept coughing, stomping on the floorboards to get their attention. Josie yelled again. Finally, the creaking and thump of the stairs being lowered, then the man's footsteps. Thomas's heart pounded. All this fake coughing wasn't exactly making him stronger. If he screwed this up, he could get them both killed. But if his guess was right, their captor didn't plan for either of them to walk away. It wasn't a risk Thomas was about to take with Josie's life. Thomas kept coughing as the man climbed. "Thank you." Josie sounded so relieved, telling him the man wasn't carrying a weapon. Hopefully he had one in a holster or in his pocket. If not, one step at a time. Thomas felt the boards give as the man stomped toward them. "What happened to your hood?" he asked. "You didn't put it back on," she said. "I was enjoying the air so much." "Oh, don't, please." There was movement as the guy put Josie's hood back on her. Then he took Thomas's off. As soon as he could see, he yanked his hand from behind his back and punched his captor in his most sensitive spot. This wasn't a man who should reproduce anyway. The man oomphed and pitched forward. Thomas punched him in the face and the guy fell to the side. Thomas lunged on top of him and hit him again, but he recovered fast, kneeing Thomas in the ribs, hard, twice, 3 times, then aimed a punch at his face. The first one hit his chin. "What's going on up there?" The sound came from below. Thomas couldn't think about that as the man aimed another blow. He angled to the side and the fist hit his ear. He shifted and landed an elbow in the man's chest. He levered up and throat punched him. The man gasped and Thomas hit him hard in the nose. Moisture filled their captor's eyes, blood poured from his nose. He gasped for breath. Thomas hit him again, and the man lost all fight. Thomas searched his pockets beneath his shirt, stifled a swear. No weapon. Someone was coming up. Thomas turned that direction, ignoring the burning in his ribs, the pain in his face, preparing to fight. But Josie was there, on the opposite side of the opening for the stairs, holding something in her hand. It was dark, but was that a vase? Where in the heck? The man's head popped up and she whacked him with it, hard. He tumbled back down. Thomas scrambled down behind him. The man hit the ground, reached to his back. Had to be a gun. Thomas dove, tackling him. The guy fought hard, but Thomas was fighting for his life, for Josie's life. Maybe he was stronger. Maybe he just wanted it more. He ignored the man's punches, hitting him over and over. When the guy curled in on himself, groaning, Thomas checked his pockets, grabbed his phone and his gun. He checked to make sure it was loaded and the safety disengaged before pushing himself to his feet. Everything hurt. The room was spinning. Where was Josie? Holding on to the back of a chair, he turned in a slow circle, taking in the rustic cabin. Old plaid couch, dingy yellowing shades. It was shabby chic without the chic. It looked familiar. He heard footsteps and braced himself, lifting the weapon as he turned toward the noise. Josie halted in the entry between that room and the next and held up her hands. She had a phone in one. In the other, "It's a walkie-talkie," she said. "They just said they were on their way. Maybe we can prove who they're working for with the phones." Maybe. It hurt to talk, to breathe. You didn't happen to find keys anywhere, did you? I didn't see any cars here. As she spoke, the sound of an engine reached them, coming closer. Come on! She led the way through the house to the back, pushed open a door, and burst outside. He followed, braced for gunshots, for somebody to yell at them to stop. Nobody did. Give me the walkie-talkie. He had no idea if it could be traced, but he didn't want to find out. She handed it to him, and he turned it off. They ran into the thick woods, kept running, until they were out of sight of the cabin. And then Josie stopped and bent over, heaving breaths. I'm sorry, I can't. It's okay. I need to rest. He leaned against a tree, scanning behind them, all around. He pretended he wasn't in terrible pain, pretended his lungs were working properly. They weren't. Something was wrong. If he had time to put on his paramedic hat, he might be able to figure out what. Where were they? Where should they go? There'd been something familiar about the cabin. He thought back, remembered a 911 call, a father and son on a hunting trip. The man had had a stroke, and Thomas had been one of the first responders. The son had told him he'd had to drive a mile to get cell service to call for the paramedics. I know where we are, he said. She swiveled to face him. You do? Before he could answer, he heard someone shout, This way! Thomas groaned. He'd taken too many hits. His ribs ached. His head pounded. He was running through the woods in a suit. Josie wore a dress, and her little heels were even less practical than his leather shoes. At least she wasn't one of those women who thought stilettos were all-occasion footwear. He was so tired, in so much pain. He didn't know if he had it in him to run. But the other option was a gunfight, and he definitely didn't have that in him. He dropped the walkie-talkie onto the bracken and handed her his jacket. Run that way about 20 yards and drop this, then come back. He appreciated that she did it without question. When she returned, he grabbed her hand and started moving to the left. If his memory served, and it usually did, town was south of them, and they'd find a dirt road to the west. If they could get to it, maybe move in the woods alongside it, it would lead them down the mountain until they got phone service. At least if he could get her to the road, she'd have a shot at escaping, even if he couldn't go any farther. Help me get her out of here, Lord. I just need a little more strength. By the sound of the ruckus their pursuers were making, at least Thomas wouldn't be taken by surprise if they got close. Unlike the men behind them, Thomas picked his way quietly, and Josie followed suit. Beneath trees, around bushes, up little hills and back down. They didn't need speed as long as none of those guys were trackers, which felt likely. They were thugs, not hunters, Thomas hoped. They doubled back, giving the cabin a wide berth. Nausea churned in his middle. He was hot and tired and dehydrated and injured. Maybe those things were to blame for the nausea. Maybe he wasn't badly injured, just weak. Thomas was a lot of things, but he wasn't weak. You all right? Josie asked behind him. Yup. Every breath brought agony. He checked the phone often. So far, no service. There wasn't a path, and the woods were thick and overgrown, slowing their progress. The only consolation was that their enemies didn't have it any easier, and Thomas had grown up in the woods. He'd spent years of his adult life rescuing people from the woods. If anybody could get them out of there, he could, assuming he could stay on his feet.
Chapter 33. Thomas was not okay. Josie watched with growing alarm as he led them through the thick woods. He seemed to be falling forward from one tree to the next, one support to the next. How many hits had he taken while she'd searched for a weapon? She'd ripped open a box in the attic and found a crystal vase, and she'd been about to aid Thomas in stopping their captor when it seemed he'd bested the man. But not after taking a whole lot of blows. The vase had come in handy when the guy's partner came upstairs. If only she'd hit him harder, Thomas wouldn't have had to fight him too. He was hurt, very hurt, but he kept going, determined to get them both to safety. There were no sounds of their pursuers. They'd probably taken the bait, the walkie-talkie and the jacket, and kept going in that general direction. She checked the phone she'd taken. No service. It was after 7. The sun had fallen behind the trees, but it would be another hour or more before sunset. Ahead, there seemed to be a break in the trees. Was that the road? Something glinted in the twilight. In front of her, Thomas lifted his hand, telling her to stop as he did the same. After staring a long moment, or maybe resting, Thomas crept forward. It was a car, a blue car. It looked like, "Is that Shelley's?" Thomas whispered. Before Josie could answer, Shelley yelled, "Thomas! Is that you? Josie?" It was Shelley? She was here? Josie bolted past Thomas and onto the dirt road. Shelley swept her up in a hug. "Thank God you're okay!" She held her tightly, sobbing into Josie's shoulder. "I was so worried." Josie backed away. "How are you here?" "I heard somebody mention this road. I told the police, but they didn't believe me. Nobody gets my hearing. You wouldn't believe it. Everybody's going crazy in town. Those 2 cops were shot, even the young, cute one." "Ricky?" "You need to be quiet," Josie said. "Oh, sorry." Thomas reached them, moving much more slowly. He held the gun in his hand. "His name is Rich. Is he okay?" "Yeah, but the other one was pretty bad off. The older, cranky one. They were both taken to the hospital. The bodyguards were hit, too." She turned back to Josie. "I was so scared you were shot. Come on, let's get out of here." But Thomas leaned against the skinny trunk of a birch tree, and he didn't look ready to move. "I'm sorry. How did you find us again?" "Somebody said the name of this road." "Who?" "In the crowd, after the press conference and the shots. I overheard—" "Who said it, Shelley?" Thomas wasn't moving, and he wasn't kidding. "I don't know. I didn't see the person. I just overheard—" "She's lying." The words came from a familiar voice, though Josie couldn't see him and couldn't imagine how he could be there. "Bentley!" she called. Thomas lifted the gun. He aimed it at Shelley, then at Bentley when he stepped into the clearing. "What are you doing?" Josie asked. "Put the gun down. Have you lost your mind?" "How are they here?" He shook his head, his skin pasty and pale. "Doesn't make sense." "He's right, Josie," Bentley said. "It doesn't make sense." Donley stepped into the clearing beside him. "You're okay." Josie stepped toward the bodyguard who'd tried so hard to protect her. The sight of him, standing, seemingly safe and sound, sent grateful tears to her eyes. "Thank God." "Bullet grazed my thigh." "More than grazed it," Bentley said. "Must have, considering he'd gone down." Shelley's gaze flicked to the men. "How did you get here?" "We followed you." Bentley glared at her. "It had to be you." "What are you talking about?" Her voice was shrill, loud. "Quiet!" Josie hissed the word. There were still men looking for them. "However it happened, I'm glad you're here." Shelley reached for Josie. "Come on, get in, and let's get out of here before somebody finds us." To Bentley, she said, "My car only seats 4, but you 2 can follow us back to town." "I don't think so." The words came from Thomas. He still held the gun, and it was aimed Shelley's way. Josie looked between them. "Thomas, what are you doing?" Shelley lifted her hands. "What is wrong with you? Let's go before they come." Her voice was too loud, almost as if she wanted them to be found. Shelley could be a little thick, but she wasn't that dumb. Bentley walked closer to her. "Why don't you give Josie your keys, and she can drive Thomas to town? You can ride with us. Donley's SUV is just down the road." Shelley's gaze flicked between Bentley and Josie. "Just get in, Joe." "The man's about to collapse," Bentley said. "If you really care about them." Shelley was wearing a jacket, a long-sleeved windbreaker, even though the temperature had to be in the upper 70s. It didn't make sense. Until she stuck her hand in the pocket. Josie got a glimpse before chaos erupted. Thomas yelled, "Gun!" Bentley and Donley rushed across the space. Bentley tackled Josie, landing on top of her. A gunshot rang out. There were sounds of a struggle. Josie squirmed out from beneath Bentley and peered over him. Donley was lying on top of Josie's oldest friend, her best friend. Shelley turned her head and met Josie's gaze. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look hurt. She looked furious. She fought the man on top of her. "Get off me! Get off me!" Donley held her down, shoved a hand in her pocket, and came out with keys. He tossed them to Josie. "Go. Get Thomas to the ER. We'll take care of her." "But that gunshot went wide," he said. "Thank God, but the men will be coming." Donnelly held her eye contact. "We got this, Josie. Go." Go. She turned toward Thomas. He'd collapsed. Before she could process it, Bentley was at his side, helping him up. He maneuvered him into the passenger seat of Shelley's car, while Josie climbed in the driver's seat. Thomas groaned, held out the gun he'd taken from the cabin. Just in case. Bentley took it and looked across the seat at Josie. "Call 911 as soon as you have service." Before she could respond, Bentley slammed the door and jogged to Donnelly to assist with Shelley. Josie would have plenty of time to think about what just happened. Later. At that moment, Thomas needed medical attention. She did a 3-point turn and headed down the mountain, glancing at Thomas as she hit the gas. He'd passed out. Josie hadn't been alone in the waiting room for 10 minutes before Thomas's friends started pouring in. People she'd seen in her café, people who, before the dinner Sunday night, she'd only known by their drink orders. The blonde who preferred tea got there first, hugged her, and then reintroduced herself as Grace. She came with 2 brunettes, Tabby and Cassidy. Cassidy carried a little baby, while Tabby rubbed her expanding belly. Her usual order had changed from Americano, with an extra shot, to water with lemon a few months before. Grace's husband, Andrew, was the first man to join them, but not the last. Within an hour, the waiting room at the hospital in Plymouth was full of people whose faces had become familiar, but whose names she mostly couldn't remember. She'd met Aspen, the blonde from Hawaii. Josie'd given her a ride one night, and when she walked in the door with Garrett, she hugged Josie tight. "We're praying for Thomas, and for you. Is there anything else we can do?" They'd all asked her a version of that question, but there was nothing these kind people could do, nothing but pray. And be support for her. As she sat beside them, the truth hit her. She hadn't known how badly she needed support, needed community, until Thomas had nudged his way into her life. She'd been going it alone in Coventry for too long, content with her long-distance relationships with her parents and Shelley. After the intern's death, Josie had felt she didn't deserve friends, didn't deserve a good life. What foolishness was that? Jesus hadn't come to punish her. He'd come to give her abundant life, to deny herself that life wasn't selfless or good. It was arrogant, as if she alone knew what she deserved. God had forgiven her. Jesus had died for her, so she could live, free, happy, glorifying Him. Instead, she'd been hiding, scorning the life He'd died to give her. No more. Soon, she'd tell the world what she and Bentley had done. She'd tell the world what Mitchell had done. She'd come clean about all of it, and then she'd live, even if everybody rejected her. But Thomas wouldn't, her parents wouldn't, and these Coventry folks seemed like the loving, forgiving type. Maybe when this was all over, she'd be freer than she'd ever been before. As long as Thomas survived. Please, God, please! The doctor had explained that he'd been bleeding internally, and that all the fighting and then walking after that had only made it worse. Everything he'd done to save her. How much pain must he have been in? How weak must he have felt? He would be undergoing surgery any minute now. The surgeon had seemed confident. Thomas should come through this alive. But what if he didn't? Please, I can't lose him now. Aspen squeezed her hand from the chair at Josie's side. He's going to be okay. The woman smiled at her, and that expression infused confidence. Did they say how long? The surgeon wasn't sure. She said it depended on what they found when they went in. Well, we'll all be here, however long it takes. One of them, the tall man with the little girl, the one married to the redhead, called above the murmur of voices. Hey, let's pray together. Aspen stood and reached for Josie. Come on. She joined the circle of friends and prayed silently as they lifted their pleas to God. She'd heard sermons delivered by some of the most skillful pastors in the world. She'd been in beautiful cathedrals and heard world-renowned choirs, but never in her life had she felt the Spirit move like He did in that room. These people, this little group of friends, had power Josie could only marvel at. All the power in the Capitol, in the White House, in Washington, was nothing compared to the power Josie experienced in that waiting room. Not human power, but God's power. Her fears dissipated. God was in this. He could be trusted. When the prayer ended, Josie accepted hugs from Thomas's friends. She really needed to learn all their names, and started to return to her chair. But movement in the doorway caught her eye. Chief Coat waved her over. Thank God he was there. A detective had met her at the hospital, but he'd had no information about what had happened on the mountain with Shelley, Bentley, and Donley, and he had shared very little about how the two cops and Greta were doing after the ambush. She was desperate to know. She followed the police chief into the hallway. "How's Thomas?" he asked. "In surgery. How are the others?" "Donley, you know. The bullet grazed his leg, but a paramedic treated it on site. He refused to go to the hospital. The other bodyguard, Greta Wagner, was hit in the side of the head." Josie gasped. "She's all right." Chief Coat pressed his huge palm against Josie's upper arm and squeezed before dropping it again. If she'd shifted 1 inch to the side, it would have killed her. As it was, it took off her ear and a chunk of her skull. Though she'll need plastic surgery, she'll recover. "Thank God," Josie said. "Officer Fontier, Rich, was shot in the shoulder. He's stable. Officer Tyler's wounds are the most serious. The bullet went through his middle, hit his intestines. He had surgery, but—" Coates' voice hitched. "It doesn't look good. He could die." "There were 2 shooters," Coates said. "They'd set up in a vacant house across the street from the parking lot. They kept firing until you guys were gone, then took off. We believe they must have run through the yards to the block behind. We're not sure how they escaped yet." Josie had already given a statement, but she'd been so distracted by Thomas's injuries. She couldn't remember what she'd said. To be safe, she told the chief what happened right after they'd been taken, how they'd been transferred to a different vehicle right away, how someone, maybe 2 people, had entered, breathing heavily, and how she'd thought they'd all left in the one vehicle. That would explain how we never found the shooters or the van. We've already got a team searching homes near the police station. Right now, we have 5 people in custody. 2 men were found in the cabin. 2 more were detained by your bodyguard and your friend, Mr. Kent. Seriously? How did they do that? That Donley's got skills. Coates seemed impressed. She guessed that didn't happen often for the hardened cop. Was he special forces? No idea. I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, none of the thugs are talking. We detained Miss Sanders, but she refuses to speak to anybody but you. The words brought a fresh jab of betrayal. Surely Shelley hadn't been working against her all this time. But Bentley and Donley had both seemed convinced. And she had the gun. And gave Josie that scathing look. "What do you think? Did she—" His face softened with compassion. "I'm sorry. I know she was your friend." "I don't understand. She really does have excellent hearing. Maybe she did hear someone mention that road. Did she tell the police about it?" "Not as far as I've heard. Besides, it's a dirt road. The locals call it the pass, because you can use it to get from one highway to another. But it's not a real road. In other words, she might have overheard someone mention it, but she wouldn't have been able to find it on a map. Not only that, but it's miles long, yet somehow she just happened to have stopped a few hundred yards from the cabin. The story might have worked to get you and Mr. Windham in the car, but beyond that, it doesn't hold water." Shelley had betrayed her. Josie's oldest friend, her best friend in the world. Josie asked, "Do you know why?" "She'll only talk to you. I know Mr. Windham is in surgery, but the sooner we do this—" "Now? You want me to come now?" "We transferred her to a local police department, so you don't have to go all the way back to Coventry. She's about 5 minutes from here. Normally we wouldn't do it this way, but someone hired the guys we detained. We need to know who's behind all this." Josie knew exactly who was behind this. If Bentley and Carlyle were here, they might be conniving a way to use this as a winning play in the political game. But Josie wasn't playing that game anymore. She wanted justice. "How long will I be gone?" "Depends on her, I guess. If something happens with Thomas, I'll bring you right back." "Okay, let me just tell them where I'm going." 15 minutes later, Josie followed Chief Coat into a drab, squat building the shape of a mini-mall. Tabby had insisted on joining her and walked at her side. Josie hardly knew the woman, but that didn't keep Tabby from holding her hand, squeezing it for support. How had she not realized before how wonderful the people of Coventry were? She didn't want to think about everything she'd been missing by hiding behind her coffee counter. They stepped inside, and a familiar man walked their way. He drank his coffee black and always ordered a scone to go with it. He had longish hair and wore a suit, and he greeted Tabby with a kiss before holding his hand out to Josie. "Fitz McCaffrey." Tabby nudged Josie's shoulder. "My husband." "Oh, nice to meet you." "Sorry it's under such terrible circumstances. How's Thomas?" "In surgery." The doctor seemed optimistic, but she didn't want to end the sentence. Fitz's voice was gentle. "He's a fighter." He turned to Coat. "Ready?" He led the group to a conference room set up with video monitors. Just as Josie was about to follow Fitz out, Coat gripped her upper arm. "Don't tell her about Zach or Thomas's injuries. We don't want her to know attempted murder is on the table. Right now, she thinks it's just kidnapping." "But they shot at us." "We think they weren't shooting to kill. If she learns that 2 people might die." Josie cringed at the words, and Coat's voice softened. "Sorry, I'm sure Thomas will be all right. The point is, we don't want her to clam up. Got it?" At her nod, Fitz escorted Josie to a smaller room with a table in the center and chairs on both sides. Shelley was seated on the far side, hands cuffed and resting on the laminate top. Her usually perfectly curled blonde hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged. The windbreaker was dirty, one sleeve torn. But what surprised Josie most was the look in her oldest friend's eyes. She'd expected to see hope, regret, maybe pleading. She'd expected to see tears. But her friend held the same expression she'd worn on that dirt road. Josie had thought it was anger at the time, but now she named it rightly. Loathing. Josie glanced at the uniformed officer in the corner, but he didn't acknowledge her. She slipped into the chair facing Shelley. "You wanted to talk to me?" Shelley lifted her bound hands, let them drop. "I'm sure you're wondering about this." When Josie didn't respond, Shelley flashed her signature smile. "Didn't think I had it in me, did you?" "I never would have believed it, not in a million years." "You always did underestimate me." Josie wasn't sure how she should play this. What she wanted to do was scream at Shelley to hurry up and tell the truth. What she wanted was to get back to the hospital, to check on Thomas. But people had been shot. 2 men could die. And this woman, this friend, had been involved in it all. "Did I?" Josie asked. "I think perhaps I overestimated you. I thought you were kind and good and trustworthy. Come to find out, you're none of the above. You think I'm a lot to take. At the thought of spending time with me, you said to Thomas, 'Pray for me.'" Josie cringed at the quotes, knowing she'd said both things about her friend in the previous few days. "At least Thomas just referred to me as Ditzy. I can own Ditzy from a practical stranger, but you're supposed to be my friend." "You're right. I love you. You know that. But sometimes you do tend to barrel in. You're a tiny package with a huge personality. One you feel like you have to apologize for." "Not apologize, just—" There was no defense for saying hurtful things about her friend. "It's not like it's new," Shelley said. "I've been hearing your opinions of me as long as I've known you. I mean, I expect it from other people, but you— Do you have any idea how hard it is to hear everything? To walk out of a room and hear what people say about you as soon as your back is turned?" "I'm sorry, I have no excuse." "I'm shocked. Little Miss Perfect apologizes." "I'm far from perfect, as you well know." A smile spread on Shelley's pretty face. "Far from it. Why don't you just tell me all the things I'm guilty of so we can be done with this conversation?" She made a show of checking her watch. "Believe it or not, I have other places to be." Shelley's smile didn't fade. "I know what you did. Unfortunately, my sins are myriad. You're going to have to be more specific." Shelley leaned close and whispered, "She was 20 years old, and you killed her." Josie sat back. "Are you talking about Mitchell's?" And then Josie understood. The new boyfriend, the one who was at a summer house with his children. The one she'd claimed was named Jay. His name definitely started with J, and he wasn't at a summer house. The new boyfriend was out of the country on a family vacation. And the part about him being divorced, that was a lie too. Because the new boyfriend was Jude Mitchell. How long have you been seeing him? Shelley shrugged. We're in love. He's married. He's getting a divorce. You're a fool, Shelley. Josie shook her head. A foolish, foolish pawn in a game you don't even understand. That's it, isn't it? You think I'm stupid. I think. She paused to take a breath, to consider her answer. She lowered her voice. That girl he was seeing, do you know how she died? Suicide because you sent her those pictures. Maybe suicide, but Bentley never believed it, and frankly, I'm not convinced. Shelley's eyes narrowed the slightest bit. She took a bunch of pills. She killed herself. Or Mitchell had her killed. There were markings on her window indicating someone might have broken in. You know, like somebody broke into my house the other night. There were signs of a struggle. There were bruises on the woman's neck. Oh, and the pictures were nowhere to be found. Sure, it looked like a suicide, but maybe it was made to. You're lying. I have the police report. I'll be happy to show it to you. Shelley stared, and for a brief moment, Josie thought she might soften, tell the truth. But then her friend's countenance hardened. He would never do that. If you think Jude Mitchell is going to leave his wife for you, then you're stupider than I thought. Josie's heart was pounding in her chest, but she forced her breathing to even out. The worst kind of stupid. He got you to betray your best friend for a promise that, mark my words, will prove as solid as vapor. Just tell me what you wanted to tell me. I don't know if you noticed, but your thug friends really did a number on Thomas. I'd like to get back to the hospital. A hint of regret crossed her features. I'm sorry he got hurt. Sure you are. What do you want, Shelley? I wanted to tell you that I didn't do anything wrong. I overheard the name of that road in town. I asked around until I found somebody who could tell me where it was, and I drove up there. And just happened to be parked in that very spot. No, I stopped the car every so often and got out to listen and look. I thought maybe I'd hear voices that would lead me to you, or see a house or something. Instead, I heard what sounded like someone moving through the woods. So I waited. And then Thomas whispered, and I knew I'd found you. I wasn't a part of any of this. Except you lied to us. You said you tried to tell the police what you'd overheard, but they wouldn't believe you. I knew they wouldn't. It was utter chaos there. I figured I'd find you and then call them. Josie might have believed the story, except Shelley was in a relationship with Mitchell, and Mitchell was the mastermind behind all of this. And there was the matter of the gun she'd pulled from the windbreaker. Shelley had been sitting at Thomas's table at the fundraiser. She could have drugged Josie's drink. Shelley was the one who'd gotten Josie's dress off and left her unclothed, which worked very nicely for whoever took those photos. If not for her memory of that man in her room, she might have believed Shelley took the photos. Shelley could have unlocked the window, but Shelley hadn't known about Dad's plan to vote no. Except, she'd shown up moments after they'd hung up with Dad. If Shelley had been outside, with her super hearing, she could easily have overheard. It didn't explain how she'd set up the ambush at the police station, since she hadn't known Donley's plan. Maybe he'd discussed it with somebody when Shelley was nearby. She'd known, somehow. Josie stood. Good luck with that story. She tried the door, but it was locked. She turned to the cop in the corner. Bang on it, he said. She did. If Shelley wasn't going to confess, there was no reason for Josie to be there. I would never hurt you. But Shelley's words were flat, emotionless. If Josie turned toward her, she figured she'd see that same loathing in her eyes. She didn't want to see it, but she turned anyway. I always believed that. I might have said less than kind things about you over the years. For that, I'm sorry. Next time somebody gossips about you, I recommend you call her on it, not conspire to have her kidnapped. She knocked again, and the door swung open. Coate glowered at her, whispering, Maybe you should go back in and try again. If she thought Shelley had any intention of confessing, she would. But this was all a game to Shelley, a pathetic game with a pathetic prize. A man who would use her and then spit her out like a chewed piece of gum. No sense whispering, Chief. She can hear everything you say. It's her superpower. Josie brushed past him. Behind her, she heard Shelley say, "Hey, Chief." "Sit tight," he said. "No, I need to say something." Josie stopped in the long hallway to listen. Maybe Shelley would confess. Maybe she'd ask him to talk Josie into going back in there so she could explain. The police chief stood in the open door. "What?" "Lawyer."
Chapter 34. Thomas opened his eyes and glanced around, looking for Josie. It seemed like she was always there. She'd taken to sleeping on the chair by his bed. When he told her to go home the night before, she just laughed him off. If the tables were turned, you'd be here. He couldn't argue with that. He pushed the button to raise the head of his bed. The slight movement sent stabbing pain to his abdomen. He had 3 broken ribs. One of them had nicked a blood vessel, which had caused internal bleeding. The day before, the doctor had explained that if he hadn't gotten to the hospital when he did, he very well could have died. The Lord had chosen to spare him. For that, he was so thankful. He was also surprised to find he was alone. He didn't think he'd been alone since he'd arrived at the hospital 2 days earlier. Josie was always there, along with one or more of his friends, or his parents, or his siblings, who'd driven up when they'd heard the news. He hadn't had a moment's peace. Not that he was complaining, but the only one he'd wanted was Josie. Where was she? The clock in the corner showed 10 a.m. He'd been awakened by the nurses early but had fallen back asleep. Maybe Josie had gone for breakfast or coffee. Maybe she'd gone home to get a shower. The doctor, a pretty brown-haired woman who was even tinier than Josie, stepped into the hospital room. Knock, knock. "Morning, Dr. Crichton." She turned to the computer in the corner. "How you feeling?" "Better, much better." "Really? Or are you just saying that because you want to go home?" She could see right through him. "I am better, just maybe not much." After she gave him a quick examination that involved her stethoscope and his deep, painful breathing, she said, "You've improved." "Told you. That means I can go home, yes?" She laughed. "Let's see how you do moving around today. It won't kill you to stay another night." "It might, Doc." He wore his most serious expression. "You don't know." She shook her head, unimpressed. "You up for visitors?" "Always. They were waiting for me to finish." She left, and a moment later, Josie stepped in, followed by a crowd of people. Bentley and Donnelly were first, Chief Coat behind them. Then a pretty woman with dark blonde hair walked in beside an older, distinguished gentleman. "Oh," Thomas pushed his bed up higher. "Don't sit up on our account." Senator Harrington approached and shook his hand. "Davis Harrington." "Thomas Windham, it's an honor, sir." The man turned to his wife. "You've met Marie." "Nice to meet you in person, Mrs. Harrington." Thomas shook her hand too. The movement only hurt a little. She smiled, the expression so like Josie's, it made his heart expand. "A polite Yankee." Her southern accent was almost lyrical as she shook her head. "I continue to be amazed." They stood at the end of the bed. Bentley and Donnelly rounded to the far side. "How you doing?" Bentley asked. "Sorry to say, it looks like I'm going to make it." The man chuckled. "I'll somehow survive the disappointment." Donnelly barely cracked a smile. He'd been by the day before, but hadn't said much. Just hovered in the corner, continuing to protect Josie, even though most of their enemies were in custody. "How's the leg?" Thomas asked Donnelly. "Just a scratch." It had been much more than a scratch, but the man had proved tough and fearless under pressure. Despite the bullet wound, he'd managed to apprehend Shelley, and then both the men who'd been following Thomas and Josie through the woods. And okay, maybe Bentley had helped. A little. The 2 guys Thomas had beaten had still been at the cabin when the police got there. Seemed the 4 had all been using the single van, a Mercedes van painted to look like an Amazon delivery truck. No wonder they'd moved through town without being stopped. Josie approached the other side of the bed and leaned down to kiss Thomas's cheek. The doctor seemed pleased when she left. "I might get to go home today." Josie's smile faded, but she didn't argue. If it were up to her, he figured he'd be trapped in that hospital bed until he was well enough to run a marathon. He took her hand and squeezed. "I'm okay, sweetheart." She lifted their joined hands and kissed his knuckles. She held his gaze a long moment. Senator Harrington cleared his throat. We wanted to thank you in person. All I did was not die. Thomas tore his eyes away from Josie to look at her father. It's possible our escape only made everything more complicated. I mean, if they'd planned to let us go. His words faded as the people surrounding his bed cast each other knowing glances. What? Coate fielded the question. We're not sure that was the plan. We've been able to put most of the pieces together. Dr. Jude Mitchell's phone linked us to one of the thugs. His name is Leo Richards, and he seemed to be in charge. The chief paused, so Thomas said, Never heard of him. He's been arrested multiple times down in Massachusetts, spent time in prison. He was the tall one the night my car alarm went off, Josie said. The guy who took the pictures when I was arrested, and the man who kidnapped us. You identified him? She nodded. I barely saw his face, but his body style matched what we'd seen, and I heard his voice. It was him. So he was the one who did this. Thomas patted his wrapped ribs. The chief answered. That's what Josie told us. When faced with all the evidence, Miss Sanders finally started talking. She admitted to drugging Josie's drink. She loosened the lock on the window so Richards could more easily break in. Apparently, the senator said, she overheard when we were on the phone discussing my vote. She must have passed that information along, setting this all in motion. If she hadn't heard that, then I think our plan would have worked. Thomas squeezed Josie's hand. I'm so sorry, sweetheart. Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't say anything. When Thomas looked forward again, he caught Mrs. Harrington's curious, maybe calculating gaze. He'd gladly tell her everything, if there weren't so many people in the room. If things worked out as Thomas hoped and prayed, he'd have plenty of time to tell Josie's mother exactly how he felt about her daughter. Donnelly said, Only thing we still don't know is how they knew where to set up the ambush after the press conference. I still say it was obvious. Bentley turned to the man beside him. You weren't going to go out front, and you'd gone in through the police station. If somebody was watching, we could have gone out the front, Donnelly said. We could have gone out the back door of the municipal building. We seriously considered using the side door. Somebody had to know. Then you must have said the plan when Shelley was nearby. I didn't. Donnelly glowered at Bentley. Thomas had the feeling the men had had this conversation before. I have a theory. Everybody turned to him. He hated to say this. He hated to even think it. The thought had come to him in the middle of the night, and he hadn't been able to shake it. In fact, the more he thought about it, the more sense it made. He turned to Chief Coate. Have you looked into Rich Fontier? The man blinked, narrowed his eyes. Why? I hope I'm wrong, but the night of Josie's alarm, there was a second man, shorter and stockier. He was about the same size as Rich. A lot of men are that size, the chief said, and you said you didn't see his face. I didn't, but Zach responded to the call alone that night. He said Rich was home with a stomach bug, but when I asked Rich about it the day Josie was arrested, he seemed confused. He probably didn't realize you'd known he was sick, the chief said. That was what I thought at the time. But, he turned to Josie, it was Rich who found the drugs in your car, right? She nodded slowly, turning to the detective beside her. He went straight to the trunk. He got a tip. Coate's words didn't hold the confidence they had earlier. He got it? Thomas asked. Coate's chin dipped, his lips pressed tight. Said he did. Okay. Thomas swallowed and shook his head. The night of the fundraiser, I saw Shelley and Rich talking. I thought it was strange because Rich was supposed to be acting as security for the party, but he seemed pretty engrossed in the conversation. Say what you want about her, Mrs. Harrington said, but Shelley's an attractive woman. Sure, Thomas said, but Rich is married with children. The woman's expression darkened. Not that that would have stopped her. It was Rich, the chief said, turning to Josie, who bagged your glass that night. The glass that had no sign of rohypnol in it, Bentley added. Son of a... All right. Senator Harrington turned to the police chief. This is one of your officers? One of my best. And he was shot. In the shoulder, Donnelly said. And he was involved in all the planning. Josie's eyes widened. He fell in front of the door, blocking our way back into the building. Because of a shoulder injury. Donnelly didn't look impressed. A through and through. The chief drooped as if a very heavy weight had fallen on him. I'll get to the bottom of this. See that you do, the senator said. I want everybody involved in this behind bars. You and me both, the chief said. Speaking of which, I understand the FBI has arrested Mitchell. Shelley cut a deal in exchange for everything she knew, the senator said. Once she realized the true endgame, she turned on him. Wait, the true endgame? It reminded Thomas. You said something about how maybe they weren't going to let us go? Coat rubbed the back of his neck. I just can't believe Rich. We played ball together, Thomas said. We were friends. He looked at Josie, realizing he must be feeling only a tiny portion of the betrayal she was dealing with. The FBI checked all their bank accounts, Coat said. Richards had received an electronic transfer of $200,000 the day of the shooting. Considering that happened before the kidnapping, we can assume there was another payment coming after it was finished. Whoa, Thomas said. That's a lot of money. The chief held his gaze. More than the going rate for a kidnapping. Oh. You're saying? I'm saying he was probably going to kill you. He's been suspected of contract killing in the past, but the police down in Lowell hadn't been able to make those charges stick. Then why keep us hooded? To keep you from fighting. It was Donnelly who spoke. To make you think there was hope. As long as you had hope that they'd let you go, they figured you wouldn't try to escape. But they pegged you wrong. Probably more dumb luck than anything else, Thomas said. Josie gripped his hand. We haven't put our faith in luck, Thomas. The Lord let us out of there. She was right. God had been there. The chief patted Thomas awkwardly on the shoulder. Glad you're improving. Thanks for everything. The chief's lips pinched at the corners as if he might be trying to smile. Good chance you're going to be my boss come January, so I figured I'd better do my best work. His boss? Thomas wasn't so sure about that. You always do your best work, Chief. That I do. How's Zach? They thought he wasn't going to make it. Your friends had some kind of a prayer thing at the hospital on his behalf last night. Probably not related, but he turned a corner. Looks like he's going to survive. You might consider, Thomas said, that it is related. Coach shrugged. Doubt he'll be able to stay on the force, but at this point, I think his family just wants him home. If I find out Rich was involved, the chief shook his head. Anyway, I'll be in touch. He walked out the door. Thomas settled back against the pillows as the information they'd discussed settled into place in his mind. For 2 days, he'd been thanking God that he hadn't gotten Josie killed with that stupid escape plan. Now he knew the truth. You saved our daughter's life, Senator Harrington said. Thomas swallowed and waited until he could speak without emotions leaking out. We did it together. Josie squeezed his arm. You did it, Thomas. You almost died saving us. She kissed his cheek. I owe you my life. You swing a mean vase, though. She shook her head, her small smile telling him she thought he was being ridiculous, but didn't plan to call him on it. He loved that smile, and those eyes that so freely expressed her feelings. He'd seen disgust in them, amusement, and terror, but at that moment, he only saw love. He wanted to stare into those eyes for the rest of his life. The senator cleared his throat. Anyway, I just wanted to say how sorry I am all this happened to you two. Josie's voice cracked when she answered. It wasn't your fault, Dad. She and Bentley had confessed the incident involving Mitchell and his intern to her father the day before. She'd been tearful when she'd told Thomas last evening about the disappointment she'd seen on her dad's face. Maybe he'd been disappointed, but he'd also flown to New Hampshire, and the look he was giving Josie now held only affection. The senator said, I dragged you into a very ugly business. You have a gift for strategy, but if I were any kind of a father, I'd have steered you to a different career. I wanted to work for you. That's because you were young and idealistic. You didn't understand the world where I live, where my family for generations has lived. I wanted to do good. I've tried to do good. You have done good, Dad. Look at the bill. It was defeated because of you. Her father had told Parker and the vice president what was going on. They'd pulled in the minority leader, and the four of them had decided on a plan. The senator had voted yes, and the vice president had voted no. The bill had been defeated, and Parker, horrified at what had been done on Mitchell's behalf, had agreed it wouldn't be brought to the floor again in any form. This is a corrupt business, the senator said. We try to do the right thing, but there are always deals being made, palms being greased. My dad and granddad, he shook his head sadly. I loved those men, loved them fiercely, and they did some good. But a lot of ugliness remained because of them. I wanted to be different. And you have been. Maybe, he said, but pulling you into the whole mess of corruption and deceit. He slipped past his wife to Josie's side and took her hand. He lifted it and pressed their joined hands against his chest, facing her alone. Thomas felt like an intruder in a private moment. He turned away. I'm glad you got out, Senator Harrington said. It's time for me to do the same. It's time for someone young to step into the role, someone without all the baggage, someone idealistic who can take on the powers that be. You're not resigning, Josie said. I'll finish my term. Mrs. Harrington studied her husband's back, a look of pure pride on her face. Someone knocked. Then a woman said, "Oh." They all turned, and Josie stepped aside enough for Thomas to see the nurse, Trish. I need to get the patient's vitals. The senator clapped Thomas's shoulder, which felt like the only thing uninjured on his whole body. We'll see you later, son. His wife added, I do look forward to getting to know you better. Thomas could only smile at the twinkle in the woman's eye. Josie said, be back in a few, and walked out with her parents. Bentley watched her leave, then scowled at Thomas. Glad you're not gonna die. You ever leave politics, you could write condolence cards. Bentley pressed his hands to his chest. I'm just a warm-hearted kind of guy. He turned for the door, and Thomas had the distinct impression he was hoping to catch Josie. But Thomas wasn't worried. Josie seemed to know what she wanted, and it wasn't to return to D.C. It wasn't Bentley. Miraculously, it was Coventry and him. Bentley glanced back at Thomas. I guess I'll see you around. Thomas held out his hand. Bentley looked at it a long moment before he shook it. Thomas met his rival's gaze. Thank you for being there. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't been. Once again, Bentley's eyes flicked toward the door. Don't screw it up. I'll swoop in and steal her back. Thomas tightened his grip, ignoring the ache in his ribs. I wouldn't expect anything less. After Bentley left, Donnelly shook Thomas's hand. Headed back to Boston. I hope your next assignment is dull as dirt. You and me both. The man cracked a rare smile, but it didn't hold. Glad you were there for her. I'm sorry I wasn't. You were shot. I think you get a pass. Besides, in the end, if not for you and Bentley, we'd have been delivered right back into the lion's den. Donnelly shook his head. Not sure I could have lived with that. Thomas understood exactly how he felt. If anything had happened to Josie, he wasn't sure he could have lived with it either. But they'd both survived. Thank God they'd both survived.
Chapter 35. Josie stood at the edge of the ice skating rink that had been set up in the park. The lake wasn't frozen yet, but the little man-made rink was solid as granite, proved by the people who were enjoying it so much. Children laughing, parents teaching their toddlers how to navigate the rented skates, couples gliding hand in hand, all while Christmas songs played overhead. It was the Saturday after Thanksgiving, and the locals had gathered for the annual festival. The ice skating rink was the biggest attraction. Thomas had told her about his plans to bring in snowmaking machines the following year, assuming there wasn't snow on the ground already. He'd clear out an area for sledding. It would require bulldozers to take out a few trees on a nearby hill, and maybe to move dirt to make the slight incline a little steeper. Apparently, he'd given Farley the idea, but the current mayor hadn't been impressed. Lame ducks didn't like to work that hard. Once Thomas took office in January, he'd be able to enact a lot of his plans, and not just for the Christmas festival. He'd told her about his strategy to get new hotels, not big resorts, but small places, both family-oriented and posh, on the lake. As it stood, folks who visited Lake Ayasha had to drive straight through Coventry to get there. Thomas's idea was to put in a highway that would circumvent downtown and then build a road from the resort area to link them. That way, people could still enjoy the shops and restaurants in Coventry, but it wouldn't add an undue amount of traffic. The resorts themselves would help pay for the road. It was a brilliant idea. Josie was proud of him. So proud. She checked on her food truck. She'd purchased it used, figuring it would come in handy for town festivals. It seemed the locals found reasons to gather at the park about once a month, and if the truck did a decent business, it would be paid for within 2 years. Sure enough, people waited in line to buy coffee and hot chocolate, sandwiches and pastries. James, owner of the Patriot, ambled close. "I used to get a lot of customers on festival days." His voice was wistful. James was a friend of Thomas's, now a friend of hers, despite the fact that they were business rivals. "Too bad you didn't have that idea, huh?" He gave her a smirk. "It's all right. Not everybody wants to freeze their fingers off to eat dinner. I bet a good share of them will wander by my place, now that I've got that fire going." He'd built a stone fireplace in the back of his restaurant. It had probably cost a pretty penny and taken up the space of a couple of tables. But man, in the winter, people loved it. "If Thomas does what he plans to do, I think we'll both have more business than we can handle." James's expression turned to a full-blown smile. "I believe you're right. Where is he anyway?" She searched the crowd and caught sight of Cassidy, James's wife, chatting with Tabby and Fitz, who were bent over a stroller, no doubt doting on their baby. Beyond them, Reed walked beside Jackie, Ella between them, toward the playground. They'd announced Jackie's pregnancy a month or so before. Other friends were scattered among the people at the park that day, people Josie had only known by their drink orders 6 months before, but who'd become her dearest companions. Grace, Aspen, Carly. She loved these women. She felt connected to them in a way she hadn't felt connected to anybody in a long time. Zach Tyler and his wife were seated at one of the picnic tables. Zach had recovered, though he still moved slowly. As Coate had feared, he hadn't been able to return to the force. Rumor had it, he'd bought a storefront that faced the lake and planned to open a bar and grill with alfresco dining. She hated that he'd been injured, but looking at him now, a wide smile aimed at the 2 kids who looked like little mini-Zacks, she decided he looked happier than he ever had in uniform. Josie had gone public with her part in Mitchell's young mistress's death. Unfortunately, there was insufficient evidence to prove she'd been murdered. But after both Shelley and Leo Richards, the would-be hitman, had turned on Mitchell, he'd been convicted of enough crimes to send him to prison for the bulk of his life. Josie hadn't outed Bentley for his part in the scheme. She'd taken all the blowback, and she'd survived. Sure, the media had been rough on her at first, but of course they'd moved on. They'd forgotten her. And the people in this town had been supportive, and they continued to be supportive. Finally, she caught sight of Thomas, chatting with people she'd never seen before, but whose names he no doubt knew. Because that was the kind of man he was. They'd been dating officially for almost 5 months. 5 months of laughing, sharing stories, and kissing. They'd been together a month when Thomas first told her he loved her. He'd repeated the sentiment every single day since then, and still, her heart fluttered like birds' wings when she heard the words. This man, this exceptional man, knew all the ugliness of her past, but he saw beyond it. He loved her anyway. She watched as he crossed the park. Though the little snow that had fallen that month hadn't stuck, the grass was squishy with moisture, so most adults stuck to the gravel paths, Thomas included. It took time because so many people stopped to greet him. Everybody loved him. The horrid photograph had never been released, and even if it had been, these people would have believed in Thomas. He was so kind, so obviously good. How could anybody doubt him? Finally, he reached her side and leaned in to kiss her. "Good afternoon, beautiful." "Mr. Mayor." His smile faltered. "You're going to help me, right? What if I—" "You're going to be wonderful, I have no doubt." He greeted James with a handshake. James gave him a nod. "You two have fun." He walked away, heading toward his wife and child. Thomas nodded at the ice skating rink. "Shall we?" "Oh, I'm not very good." "Don't worry." He faced her, taking her hands and giving her his full attention. When he looked at her with those smoldering eyes, it was all she could do not to melt into his arms. "I'll be right beside you." He leaned down, kissed her lips so softly, so tenderly. He backed away enough to see her face. "We'll be together. We'll hold each other up." And she knew, he wasn't talking about ice skating. There wasn't a ring, and it wasn't official. He'd be taking office in 6 weeks, and he needed to focus on the job. But she also understood that, while it might not be official, it was real. They would be together. They would hold each other up. Tears prickled her eyes. Always. And forever. The end.
You've been listening to Lineage of Corruption, written by robinpatchen, narrated by Brian and Matilda. Copyright 2022 by robinpatchen. Audio copyright 2024 by robinpatchen.